Hi, good morning, Year 13. Welcome to our first recorded lesson. I'm going to be doing a few of these going forward over the course of the next few weeks, working around some live lessons as well. Now, we're going to start off with control of heart rate. And this is usually the first lesson in the nervous controls topic. I decided to do it second in order to work around a live lesson we had last week. So some of this we will have mentioned in our previous live lesson. Regardless, we can start with this diagram of the heart. Now this should be very simple from year 12, and you need to know this off by heart before we can do the topic today. I know for some people, it's been relatively difficult. So, what I'd like you to do is this diagram will be attached to the assignment. I'd like you to get this diagram, I'd like you to fill it in on a Word document, or if you really want to, you could print it out and write it in. I'd like you to tell me what is each bit. And you've got a nice word bank at the top there to make it much easier for you. Now, I'm going to move this word bank slightly because it's in the way of one of the labels, but pretty much what you need to do is you need to just pause me and complete the diagram. So hopefully you paused me. If you haven't, do now, and then we're going to go through the answers. So from the top then, we have the aorta. Now the aorta has to come out of the left ventricle, and the aorta is this one here. It's the top on the right. Okay, so it's coming out of the left ventricle, and it's going out around the body. So this one here is the aorta, the top right. We have the superior vena cava. The superior vena cava is this branch one on the top left. This is superior vena cava. The inferior vena cava is the tube coming here on the bottom left. Both of those are going to go into the right atrium. Then we have the right atrium. Now the right atrium is this section here, so it's this line here. It's the fourth up from the bottom, which is fourth down from the top as well on the left. Dead middle, that's the right atrium. You have the left atrium, it's exactly the same on the other side. Now it's the fourth down on the right, so it's where my mouse is pointing. That is the left atrium. Right ventricle, we have this large space here on the left of your diagram, but on the right in real life. That is the right ventricle, and it's the second up on the left, excuse me. And we have the left ventricle, which again is this large body down here. It's the second up on the right. This one here. Fine. We go to the tricuspid valve. The way I remember which one's which, tricuspid, bicuspid, is that we have to always try to be right. And the tricuspid valve is therefore on the right side of the heart. And to make things confusing, the right side of the heart is on the left of the diagram, so we are looking at the tricuspid valve being just about here. It's the third up on the left side of your diagram. Then we come to the mitral valve, which is the exact opposite, often called the bicuspid valve. You can call it either. And that is the third up on the right, and it's between the atrium and the ventricle here. That's the bicuspid valve. That's on the left side of the heart. Fine. Then we come to the apex. The apex is right at the bottom here. It's the name for the pointy bit at the bottom of the heart. The right pulmonary artery and the left pulmonary artery, the right pulmonary vein, the left pulmonary vein. You'll never be able to identify which is which. That should be very obvious. You'll just be asked where is the pulmonary artery, where is the pulmonary vein. But what you have is the pulmonary artery coming out of the right ventricle here, and it's splitting into two tubes. Now the right pulmonary artery obviously goes right, so it's second down on the left over here is the right pulmonary artery, and the left pulmonary artery is second down on the right over here. This is the left pulmonary artery. And then you've got the pulmonary veins. The pulmonary veins are going into the heart. They're actually going to end up coming back to the left atrium. And so we're looking, the third down from the top here is the left pulmonary vein, and the right pulmonary vein is the third down on the right over here. Hopefully that's being clear. I think what I'll do is I'll quickly put some of the answers on the diagram for you. And there you have that. So there's your answers overall. I'm not sure why there's a spare line at the top there. It's annoying, but it's fine. Hopefully that's not too difficult for you. It's Year 12 work. Some of it's just the Year 9 work. I'm hoping that for most people you've looked at that and gone, right, very easy. The only difficulty would have been, of course, that we did miss some of this over lockdown, so don't be too annoyed yourself if you didn't get it. We need to learn it now. Fine. So today what we're going to do is we're going to go over some structures that are responsible for controlling the cardiac cycle. So in Year 12 we went through the cardiac cycle, the different parts of the cardiac cycle. We talked about systole and diastole and all of that stuff. Today we're going to talk about the control of that. A lot of that we did cover at the time just because it's quite difficult not to, in all honesty. So you will probably have had the SAN, the AVN mentioned to you, maybe not the bundles of His, but today we're going to go over that in a lot of detail. So if you feel like you already recognise a lot of it, then it may be this is quite an easy lesson for you. But we're going to start off with, a slightly different thing. We're going to start off with talking about the organisation of the nervous system. Now, one of my labels has already appeared, annoyingly, and PowerPoint's going well already. The nervous system can be split into lots of different branches. There's basically lots of different kinds of neurons doing different jobs. So we've got two branches to start with. The first is the central nervous system. And hopefully everyone's aware of the central nervous system from Year 11. But if you're not, the central nervous system is made up of the brain and the spinal cord. Now that is to do with coordinating all of the signals and all of the decisions that need making, mostly conscious decisions, but some unconscious decisions controlled by the brain and spinal cord. So as an example, classic reflex action, if I put my hand into a flame by accident, walking along and just happen to run my hand through a flame nearby, I will flinch my hand away because the signal gets sent via sensory neurons to the spinal cord. The spinal cord then coordinates that information and sends some other signal back to remove my hand. Now the central nervous system does the coordinating bit. The other term you may not know about, and that's called the peripheral nervous system. Peripheral nervous system. The full word peripheral, if you can't spell it, will be on the next slide, but just make sure you copy down this diagram, because you do need to know it. And the peripheral nervous system is split into two groups, the motor system, which is already there, and the sensory system. Now the sensory system contains all the sensory neurons and all the receptors. Basically they're the ones that detect and hand to the central nervous system all the information from around you. So your eyes contain lots of light receptors, they're part of the sensory system of the peripheral nervous system. The motor system is to do with then adapting to those things you're seeing in the environment. It's making changes in your body. So examples would be the somatic and the autonomic nervous system. Now, the somatic nervous system includes all of your skeletal muscles, the ones that you're deliberately moving. So when I have a thought in my brain that I would like to move my arm to, for instance, demonstrate what my brain is, the central nervous system coordinates that, sends information along the peripheral nervous system through the motor system to somatic nerves, which then move my muscles. And we'll learn all about how muscles work in the next topic, actually. You then have a more interesting, perhaps, I think so anyway, system called the autonomic nervous system. Autonomic, it's Greek for self-naming. Basically, it means it works by itself. So this is controlling all the bits of you that that you don't have to think about. Things like heart rate, sweating, amount of saliva produced. There's literally hundreds of examples, but all of those are part of the autonomic nervous system. So you can say that these nerves that I found on this part of the body, they're autonomic nerves. They're controlling bits of the body that I don't need to think about. And again, there's two splits here into the sympathetic and the parasympathetic nervous system. And don't worry about memorizing this all at once, because we're going to go through different examples of the sympathetic and parasympathetic nervous systems today. But generally, sympathetic nerves will increase the rate of whatever is happening, and parasympathetic nerves will decrease the rate of whatever is happening. Now that's not universal, but generally. An example is the one we're going to look at today, is the heart rate. There are sympathetic nerves which are attached to your heart, which makes your heart rate increase, And there's parasympathetic nerves attached to your heart. If they're activated, they make the heart rate decrease. So you have different nerves to do different functions. Pause me if you haven't got this diagram down. It is unfortunately something we need to know, but it will come more naturally to you the more we talk about it. So the next thing I want to learn about the heart is how it is controlled. Maybe that's a bit of a jump perhaps. We're going to apply a lot of what we've just learned to the heart. And we're going to talk about how it's controlled with reference to those different kinds of nerves we talked about. Now, the first thing we want to know about the heart is that it is myogenic. Now, there's a few new terms that are coming up this lesson. This is probably the last of them, but myogenic means that it stimulates its own contractions. It's the only muscle in the body which is myogenic. It doesn't require any external stimulus. So if I take a heart out of the body and I put it in an isotonic solution with enough nutrients, enough oxygen, then it will continue to beat for all time. And in actual fact, if you want a heart transplant, you can have that heart transplant removed from someone in America or another country in Europe. They can put it in a box, an isotonic solution, cold, and they can put it on a plane and they can ship it over here and it'll continue to beat the whole way. It's myogenic. Now, the issue with this is it is necessary to control the speed of the heartbeat. And it tends to go too slow. Okay, and so it's often necessary to speed up the heartbeat. Now, that is controlled by both the endocrine system and the nervous system. We're going to talk about the endocrine system in a separate topic. The nervous system is what we're going to focus on today. So from this slide, all I need you to know is that myogenic means that it will beat independently of any external stimulus. Fine. Now, the way we control this is with two nerves. Now, I hope everybody can get the idea what kind of nerves we'll be talking about here. So go back to my little diagram here. And you think about what these different things mean. Are the nerves that are controlling the heart part of the central nervous system? Well, clearly not, because if I want to control the heart, those nerves are not going to be found inside of the brain and spinal cord. Those nerves need to be attached to the heart in order to control it. So we're talking about the peripheral nervous system. Is it a sensory process? No, it isn't. It's not. It's a motor system, because it's going to be moving. It's going to be causing movements, these nerves. Is it somatic or autonomic? Now, somatic we said was deliberate. Autonomic we said was automatic. Clearly, the heart rate control is automatic. It isn't decided by you. And whilst some people can make their heart rate go up and down, they don't do it by causing their nerves to directly be stimulated. They do it by controlling their breathing, usually. So we're talking about autonomic nerves of the motor system of the peripheral nervous system. And there are two nerves that control heart rate. One is sympathetic, one is parasympathetic. Now hopefully you can remember as well from earlier that I said generally sympathetic will increase the rate of whatever it's controlling, and parasympathetic will decrease the rate. Not always, but generally. So, we've got two autonomic nerves, one sympathetic nerve, one parasympathetic nerve. And they're attached directly to the brain, to the medulla oblongata. Now, we're going to be stimulating actually sometimes both of them at the same time, and the rate that the heart beats at is controlled by the balance. So if I'm stimulating the sympathetic more than the parasympathetic, then I'm going to be causing the heart rate to go up. And if I'm stimulating the parasympathetic more than the sympathetic, the heart rate will go down. Now, again, there's a few too many words on this slide. We just need the idea that it's controlled by a sympathetic and a parasympathetic nerve, and that's directly attached to the brain. Now that nerve obviously doesn't branch straight out of the brain and travel through my chest. It goes down my spinal cord, breaks out of my spinal cord around the area where my heart is found. Okay, fine. And remember, parasympathetic nerves will contain lots and lots of neurons, and so will sympathetic nerves, so we're stimulating lots of cells within the heart. That's fine. Now, I don't actually want you to write what's on the bottom here, but to link this to our later topic on the endocrine system, when we come on to that, when you activate the sympathetic nerve, that as a byproduct also increases the rate of adrenaline release from the adrenal glands. We'll learn all about that in the endocrine system topic. But generally, that's also going to increase the heart rate. Fine. Right. I'd like you to have a look at those 3 questions, and I'd like you to just write down the answer and nothing else. So you should have paused me. So the heart rate is described as myogenic because it is self-controlled. It can act independently of any other stimulus. Describe the different branches of the autonomic nervous system, sympathetic and parasympathetic. Describe, you could say sympathetic generally increases the rate and parasympathetic generally decreases the rate of whatever it's controlling, but to be honest, you don't need to know that. Describe a situation where sympathetic nervous stimulation of the heart will be beneficial, one might be necessary. Something like exercise would be the obvious option, and it's necessary to pump more blood around the body to provide more oxygen and nutrients for respiring muscles. Fine. Now, we talked about that in all honesty. The final thing we need to talk about when we're talking about the heartbeat is we need to talk about how it's stimulated within the heart. Now, we covered this briefly in Year 12, and so a lot of this will be familiar to you, I hope. But I'm going to go back over it again anyway, because it's very important. It's also relatively difficult, and a lot of people do struggle with it. So, we're talking about the cardiac cycle here. What I'm not going to go back over is what systole and diastole are. Spending time on that to me would seem a waste of time. Is a little bit harsh, but you can certainly go back and revise that yourself. That's not the most difficult bit here. What we are going to go over is how it's controlled. Now, inside of the heart, there are 2 bundles of cells which are used to send electrical signals across the heart. And these control the heart rate independent of the brain. So this is what makes the heart myogenic. So the initial origin of the heartbeat is found in the sinoatrial node, the SA node, right? Now, what that does is it releases a small electrical signal, which then travels across the muscle. Muscle is very, very, very good conductor of electricity. And we also have something called the AV node. Now, the AV node also sends out electrical signals, but only when it's activated by the sinoatrial node here. The atrioventricular node and the sinoatrial node. You don't actually need to remember sinoatrial and atrioventricular. I find it helpful to remember because it makes you remember which one's which. Sinoatrial, meaning all atrium, is found in the atrium, and atrioventricular is found between the atrium and the ventricle. So I remember that I like to remember those names just to make sure they don't put them in the wrong places. No one, if they knew this was called the atrioventricular node, would put it right at the top of the atrium like this one. Fine. Now, coming out of the atrioventricular node is a bundle of fibres called the bundles of His. Now, they then branch into what we call bundle branches. So you've got left bundle branch and right bundle branch, because obviously one's going left and one's going right. Now, they then, I'll move myself up there, they then split into things called Purkinje fibres. Now, Purkinje fibres are basically tiny little fibres that spread all over the ventricles. Now, I don't need all of this writing down in your book. I think that would be a waste of time. You need to know where the SA node is, where the AV node is, where the bundle of His is, where the Purkinje fibres are, and then where the bundles of His, where the bundle branches are, excuse me. So, in terms of the control, when the sinoatrial node activates, it sends an electrical impulse across the atria. Now, it's very important you understand that there is a layer of fat between the ventricles and the atria. Fat is extremely non-conductive of electricity, and so electricity, whilst it might eventually travel through the fat, will pretty much be stopped there. So the atria will be electrically stimulated, first the right and then the left, but the ventricles will not by the sinoatrial node because of this layer of fat that basically runs along where the valves are here. Now, as they spread across the atria, I hope you know that electricity makes your muscles contract. That's why if somebody shoots you with a taser, you kind of do the comedy ooh thing. Because all your muscles contract at once and it makes you do a shivering thing and go rock solid. All your muscles contracting. And then you collapse. So when you electrically stimulate the atria, they contract. They're just muscles, they contract. And as they contract, obviously, they cause atrial systole, which forces blood into the ventricles because there's a higher pressure inside the atria than inside the ventricles. As a direct consequence of that, the AV node is activated. Now, the AV node basically is very similar to the sinoatrial node. When it's activated, it's going to send a small electrical signal down the bundles of His to activate the ventricles. But what it does is it actually it builds in a delay. It's just a very short delay, but there's the difference between when you hear the heartbeat, bum 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 bum. The reason it's b is because that's the atria, and then the bum is the ventricles. And the gap between those two is caused by the atrioventricular node basically slowing down the signal. So without the atrioventricular node there, it would just go boom, 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 as everything contracted. Obviously that wouldn't work. If your atria and your ventricles are contracting at the same time, there's nowhere for your blood to go. We need the atria to contract first to force blood into the ventricles, then the ventricles to contract to force that blood out into the aorta and the pulmonary arteries. So, the atrioventricular node builds in a delay. Now, those impulses are then sent along the bundles of His, along the bundle branches, and then up through the Purkinje fibers. It travels through the ventricles, and the ventricles contract too. So, in terms of the stages here, it's sinoatrial node first, is activated. It activates itself. Okay, there's no need for any external stimulation here. This is what's controlling everything. So it activates itself. That then sends an electrical impulse across the atria, which is blocked by this fatty tissue here. That contracts the atria is the point, but it also activates the AV node, the atrioventricular node. That then waits for a very short period of time before sending the electrical impulse down the bundle of His, down the bundle branches, up the Purkinje fibers, and activating the ventricles, contracting. Fine. Fine. Right. Now, I'm hoping that you still have your heart diagram from earlier. Either earlier in year 12, you're still using the same book, or more usefully, it would be one that you got off the slide from earlier in the lesson. You need to draw onto a heart diagram. You can draw yourself a heart diagram in your book, or you can use the one from earlier. The Purkinje fibers, and the bundles of His, also the SAN and the AVN. And then I'd like you to put these in the correct order and basically write next to each one what it does. And then this third one is just something you need to think about. So pause me and have a go at this. Fine. So I hope that everybody put the Purkinje fibers were coming up from the bundle branches here, and that you put the bundle of His coming down the centre of the septum. You should put the SAN first and saying that it sends an electrical impulse across the atria, then the atrioventricular node, which slows down the electrical signal and passes it onto the bundles of His, then the bundles of His, which transport the electrical impulse down the septum, then the Purkinje fibers or Purkinje fibers, which send the electrical impulse up through the ventricles. And which part of the system do the autonomic nerves innervate? We've got to think about which part of the system do we need to speed up or slow down. That's the sinoatrial node. So the autonomic nerves, those nerves, the sympathetic and the parasympathetic nerves, are going to be coming from your brain down your spinal cord, breaking out the spinal cord and attaching themselves onto the sinoatrial node. So that if I want to increase my heart rate, I activate the sympathetic nerve more and send signals to the part of the sinoatrial node that is activated by the sympathetic nerve. And if I want to slow down the signal, I activate the parasympathetic nerve and slow down the sinoatrial node. Fine. Now, hopefully then we can feel like we've done this. So describe and locate the structures which are responsible for events during the cardiac cycle. That's the sinoatrial node, the atrioventricular node, the bundles of His, the bundle branches, and the Purkinje fibers. Explain the events which take place during the cardiac cycle to stimulate and transmit a wave of electrical activity to make the heart beat. Hopefully you feel like you can do that. We're going to go through some questions on that in a second. And then explain the roles of the SAN, AVN, and bundle of His. Again, it's basically what we just did. Right, a 5 marker to finish this part of the lesson. Now, in all honesty, have a look at that. Pause me, it's 5 marks, so you can spend 5 minutes on it, but I don't anticipate you needing to. Can you please have a go at this question? So, answers. Basically, I want to run through what we've just talked about. So, SAN sends wave of electrical activity across atria, causing atrial contraction. 1 mark. You'll note it says SAN, you can use sinoatrial node, you can call it SAN, doesn't matter. Non-conducting tissue prevents immediate contraction of ventricles. You could call it fatty tissue, you call it fibrous tissue. AVN delays impulse while blood leaves atria or ventricles fill. Fine. The AVN sends a wave of electrical activity down the bundle of His. You could also say the Purkinje fibers there. This 5th mark is an interesting one. It's something we didn't necessarily touch on too much. But of course, you've got to think about, why do I need to do this at all? Why does the AV node not just directly activate the top of the ventricles? Well, if you think about it, if the top of the ventricles contracted first, all the blood will be trapped at the bottom. And so we need it to contract from the base up. Like with a tube of toothpaste, you start from the bottom and you push up to get all the toothpaste out. And so you do the same with the heart. You start from the bottom, you contract up, and that will lead blood to leave the ventricle in its entirety. So that 5th mark is perhaps one you wouldn't have got. It's not something we touched on very much. It's logical, but not necessarily something I would expect you to get off the top of your head, so apologies for that. That is an important point, though. You should mention it. That's why we have the bundles of His, the bundle branches, and the Purkinje fibers. That's the end of this first lesson, so I would hope that by now you would be able to tell me what controls the heart rate and how it works, in terms of the different parts of the heart, and in terms of the different parts of the autonomic nervous system, sympathetic and parasympathetic. Fine. There'll be another video lesson next lesson, so keep an eye out for that. Have a great day.